Around the world, a combination of portentous signs, agricultural expansion, and human decisions sparked the growth of cities. They became crossroads of economic and cultural exchange. They grew and distributed food for thousands, even tens of thousands of people. They had artists and crafts workers, and they had fighters capable of defending them and conquering surrounding territory. North America followed this global pattern, but later Europeans and white Americans couldn't square this urban past with their assumption that Indians were primitive and nomadic, people whose use and ownership of the land were so light that it didn't really belong to them.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, looking at our country's indigenous past. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book Native Nations, A Millennium in North America by Kathleen DuVal. Soon, Professor DuVal will take the stage, and for 20 minutes or so, she'll discuss her Pulitzer Prize winning work. Then she'll be joined in conversation by Nicole Eustace from New York University. Of course, the real education and awareness comes from reading tonight's featured work. Copies of Native Nations can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I learned so much from reading this book, facts that were unknown to me and never touched on in my history books, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot too. As you place your order on the bookstore's website, do input the code AMINS25 so they know that your book should come signed by the author on a bookplate. These special copies can be sent anywhere in the United States. Now for some background on tonight's featured author, over to my co-host, Kristen Motti, Boston Public Library.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone from the Boston Public Library. I'm Kristen Motti from the Adult Programs team. I'm an Adult Programs librarian at the Central Library here in Boston. We are thrilled to be partnering on tonight's author talk about the book Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our featured speaker, Professor Kathleen DuVal. Kathleen DuVal is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian. She is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she teaches early American and American Indian history. Her previous work includes Independence Lost, which was a finalist for the George Washington Prize, and The Native Ground, Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent. She is a co-author of Give Me Liberty and co-editor of Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America. We will meet Professor DuVal in just a moment, but first, Margaret, over to you to hear about tonight's moderator, Professor Nicole Eustace. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Nicole Eustace is Julia Silver Family Professor of History at New York University, where she directs the NYU Atlantic History Workshop. Her most recent book is Covered with Night, a story of murder and indigenous justice in early America, which you're seeing on your screen now. This book won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in History and the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians. It was also a finalist for the National Book Award and named Best Book of the Year by Time, Smithsonian, Boston Globe, and Kirkus Reviews. Professor Eustace is also the author of 1812 and Passion is the Gale, Emotion, Power, and the Coming of the American Revolution. Currently a Guggenheim Fellow, she will join us in the second half of our program. But for now, welcome to you, Professor DuVal. We are so glad you're with us. this evening, particularly as a lead up to Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, which we're all really excited to celebrate. Kristen and I, particularly this year, having delved into your book. Your book paints a clear and brilliant portrait of Native culture and politics. There's a lot to cover here, a whole millennium. So let's start right in, and over to you, Professor DuVal.
Thank you. I thought I'd start with just talking about the purpose of this book. One of the things I found in my years of teaching and writing is that Americans today are seeing Native people in all kinds of places, in TV shows, in the movies, in cases argued before the Supreme Court, holding public office. In art museums, a tremendous number of contemporary art shows by Native artists today. And I think that for an awful lot of non-Native Americans, it's hard to square that very public, active presence of Native Americans today with what version of Native American history most of us were taught. I think a lot of us were, that Native Americans are people of the past. We were taught versions that really emphasize Europeans and white Americans in the history of Native Americans, that emphasize colonization, disease, warfare, and really that present Native history as a story of decline, often very rapid decline after 1492. And present Native Americans themselves largely as victims, not as sort of the central agents in their own history, and as people of the past, which I think is part of why people sometimes find it difficult to square that public presence with this version of history, which is really wrong. It's not the right version of history. So as a historian and in writing this book, I wanted to bridge the gap for readers to show a long history, hundreds and hundreds of years, actually thousands and thousands of years in reality, of Native Americans before colonialism, before Europeans and Africans and Asians even got here, and surviving through colonialism to today. Surviving, and this is really important, not only as individual Native Americans, as individual descendants of Native peoples of the past, but surviving as nations. There are over 600 federally and state recognized tribes in the United States today. They survived. They're still here today. So what my book does is try to sort of slow down that history as it bridges this gap. It starts pre-Europeans. The first two chapters focus on change over time, changing history in North America before the arrival of Europeans. And then it also slows down the centuries after 1492 and shows that not just that because Europeans arrived, that doesn't mean that everything suddenly changed. In fact, throughout most of the continent, the vast interior of the continent, certainly, Native peoples were most of the population and had most of the power in North America into the 18th century, and for some of the continent, well into the 19th century, into the second half of the 19th century, really. So I thought I'd read a little bit before we get started on our conversation. Talk a little bit more, read a little bit, and then we'll move into questions and conversation. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of the book, just to give you a little sort of window into how the book begins. In the fall of 2016, the road leading into the camp was lined with flags. Lakotas and Dakotas of Standing Rock had been protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline since early that year. And recently, the growing crowd of protesters had spread to this new and larger camp across Cannonball River. Flying over the trucks, cars, horses, tents, teepees, newly constructed buildings, and demonstrators were more than 300 flags. Among them, the red, white, and black stripes of the Arapaho Nation, the Northern Cheyenne Morning Star, the purple Hiawatha belts with 4 white squares and a tree of peace representing the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, and the sand-colored Navajo Nation flag, which shows the outlined shape of the Navajo Reservation today between its 4 sacred mountains, under a rainbow representing its sovereignty. Some people brought American flags too, but the flagpoles flew the flags of Native nations. The flags and the people who gathered under them displayed not only the No Dapple protests' wide support among Native Americans, but also the fact that Native nations are still here in North America, despite centuries of colonialism. Today, indigenous North Americans are citizens of many hundreds of Native nations with sovereign rights within the United States, Canada, and Mexico. When Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland were elected to the US Congress in 2018, they were described as the first Native American congresswomen, but also as citizens of the Ho-Chunk Nation and Laguna Pueblo, respectively. The Standing Rock tribal chairman explained during the protests, "We're a nation, and we expect to be treated like a nation." The Standing Rock Sioux were demanding their sovereign rights as a recognized political entity with its own laws and land base. That land is Ochady-Chikoin, Lakota for 7 council fires, meaning the 7 nations of that confederacy. Native supporters came there not just as individuals, but as citizens of Native nations. So one argument of the book is about nationhood, and you sort of think back to older ways, not only that maybe we learned history in high school or so, but also the way historians, mainstream historians in colleges and universities, writing histories, the ways that they have told Native American history over time. The sort of oldest version of it was just that Native Americans were savage, were primitive, were sort of part of the wilderness destined to disappear before the arrival of Europeans. Now, historians started changing that story in the mid-20th century and created a new and closer to true story about the many travesties that Europeans and white Americans committed against Native Americans over time. But that's the version of the story that tends to emphasize victimization and decline and really only tell stories of tragedy and trouble. And sometimes they're quite as stereotyped in their vision of Native Americans as that older version was. For example, Howard Zinn described Native Americans as naked, tawny, and full of wonder. So really not that much better than the first version. And also, both of these versions, the old sort of primitive savage one, the newer sort of victimization and decline one, both of those make it really hard to understand how Native nations survived into the present. More recently, a couple generations probably, of scholars have changed the narrative again and tried to present Native Americans as at the center of their own stories and explain many, many parts of their past, not just sort of the victimization parts. And also, scholars, and especially Native scholars working within tribes, have pushed for historians to look at the present and look at Native peoples today as part of how they see their long past and see those things as connected, not see the long ago Native past as unconnected to Native Americans today. So in my book, I try in every chapter, even the chapters that take place hundreds and hundreds, 1,000 years ago, to bring into each of those chapters what Native scholars, tribal historians, Native nations today say about their own history. Another argument of the book is that Native North America is part of world history. So I start chapter 1 in the era before Europeans are here. So in the era really before world history classes or books tend to include North America, or at least north of the Aztecs, and show how we can see Native North America, even in the distant past, as part of world history. So I'm gonna start here with chapter 1 for a moment. It is rare that everyone in the world has the same thing on their minds at once. But we know one thing that everyone was talking about in the spring of the year 1006, the star. It had always been in the sky, but now it was 16 times as bright as the planet we call Venus. In some places, it was visible during the day for an entire month and startlingly bright at night for several years. Scientists today say it was the brightest supernova ever recorded. A chronicler in Baghdad wrote that its rays on the earth were like those of the moon. A monk in Switzerland recorded, A new star of unusual size appeared. It was glittering in appearance and dazzling the eyes, causing alarm. Alarm was a common reaction. An Egyptian scholar wrote about wars and famines that followed the star's appearance. Chinese astronomers worried about whether what they called guest stars were auspicious, or as one Chinese scholar put it, a sign that foretells military action, death, and countrywide famine. In our age of electric lights, it is hard to grasp how important the stars were to everyone before the 20th century. People all around the world used the sky to keep track of time. They could see countless more stars than we can today. And many cultures believed that a change in the sky meant something significant was happening. When another supernova appeared in 1054, less than 50 years later, some people believed the skies were telling them to make a change. They moved to new places and adjusted their religious beliefs and practices. Leaders used the skies for guidance and sometimes pointed to them as evidence that people should follow whatever path those leaders advised. The capital of the Ghana Empire fell around the time of the 1054 supernova, and its call to change seems to have persuaded many to convert to Islam. Both the Normans and their English adversaries saw the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066 as predicting the Norman conquest of England. It's woven into the Bayeux Tapestry. The people of North America watched the sky too. Their calendars were based on changes in the moon and in the sun's position relative to Earth. Archaeologists speculate that the second supernova, that one in 1054, inspired people who had lived in small farming towns in what's now Illinois to tear one of them down and build Cahokia, a large and influential city that would set off a trend of grand civilizations called Mississippian that spread all across the Mississippi Valley and American Southeast in the following centuries. Cahokia was just one of a constellation of city-states across the continent. Also around 1054, the already sprawling civilization of the Hohokam in what's now Arizona began its greatest period of growth and centralization. Around the world, a combination of portentous signs, agricultural expansion, and human decisions sparked the growth of cities. They became crossroads of economic and cultural exchange. They grew and distributed food for thousands, even tens of thousands of people. They had artists and crafts workers, and they had fighters capable of defending them and conquering surrounding territory. North America followed this global pattern, but later Europeans and white Americans couldn't square this urban past with their assumption that Indians were primitive and nomadic, people whose use and ownership of the land were so light that it didn't really belong to them. By overlooking the continent's history of powerful, sophisticated cities in this self-serving way, Europeans and their descendants would justify taking a continent. So the book continues, and obviously I don't want to take up too much time. I'm just going to, the book skips forward to different Native peoples during the period of colonization and shows how they continued to have power in the region. I'm just going to read you one of those, and then we'll move to our conversation. This is in 1609, and we are on the shores of Lake Champlain. As the sky began to lighten, the enemy came ashore, and the Mohawk warriors came out of their barricade. The Mohawks were an impressive sight, nearly 200 of them, painted for war, with wooden armor and helmets to protect them from their enemies' arrows, and wearing their distinctive short-feathered headdresses, which inspired terror in their enemies. The approaching Wendat, Algonquin, and Innu warriors let out a cry, and then did something unusual. When they were about 30 steps away from the Mohawks, they parted into two groups, leaving in the middle one man covered in metal from his hat to his knees. As the Mohawks pulled back their bows, preparing to shoot their first round of arrows, they heard an enormous cracking boom, as if thunder and the sound of a waterfall had combined and struck for just a moment in front of them. One of the Mohawks standing near the front fell down dead, shot right through his wooden armor. The enemy force shouted in delight. Another bang, another man fell. The Mohawks had never seen guns, and it was astonishing to see people fall without being hit by an arrow. If we rush too fast through the 17th century, We might interpret the arrival of guns as the start of native dependence and European dominance, but we would be wrong. Local rivalries, customs, and geography continue to be the most important factors in native decisions and determine the opportunities and limits for Europeans. There had been new weapons before and new ways of defending them against them. When your enemy gained some advantage, you adapted, and that is what the Mohawks did. So the Mohawks' enemies, it turned out, were being armed by the French at Quebec. And so the Mohawks began traveling to Fort Orange, which later became Albany. At the time was part of New Netherlands. So they traveled to Fort Orange to trade with the Dutch, trying to get weapons to fight their enemies who now had guns. Mohawks came to Fort Orange for the guns, but they stayed for the cake. When they visited Fort Orange, they sampled Dutch cakes, cookies, and bread and took some home for others to try. The excellence of Dutch baking was universally recognized. The English word cookie comes from the Dutch. Mohawk women made cornbread, but it may have seemed dense and mundane when compared with the treat of an airy yeasted white bread, fine cake, or cookie after making the trip to Fort Orange with a load of beaver furs and baskets of corn. To the frustration of many colonists, Mohawks' proceeds from the fur trade allowed them to pay high prices. The Dutch colonists who introduced white bread and cakes to the region soon could not afford them. Colonists repeatedly complained to the New Netherland Council that bakers sifted whole wheat flour and sold the white flour, this is what one of these petitions says, greatly to their profit to the Indians for the baking of sweet cake, white bread, cookies, and pretzels, leaving largely bran to sell to the townspeople. The petition concluded in horror. The Christians must eat the bran while the Indians eat the flour. In an effort to appease colonists, the council outlawed the sale of white bread and cake to native customers. But as with guns and with liquor, native demand prevailed. Bakers continued selling baked goods made from white flour to their best customers. Selling products that Mohawks wanted made the Dutch fur trade thrive. By the 1630s, New Netherland was exporting tens of thousands of furs every year, mostly from Mohawk sources. Trade worked in native reciprocal fashion. Mohawks profited, and the Dutch profited, even if some of them had to eat heavy whole wheat bread while Mohawks ate cake. The book goes on from there to talk about how native nations survived through not only the period in which many nations like the Mohawks retained a great deal of power, but through the late 19th century and the 20th century, and to the Renaissance that many native nations are having today. I think I will open things up at this point because I want to have a conversation with Professor Nicole Eustace, who I think will be coming on to join us here.
Hi. Sorry, there was a longer list than usual to turn on my video. It's so lovely to be here with you, Professor DuVal. Thank you so much for sharing your book with us. It's really fun to hear it out loud in your voice because your voice comes through on the page, but it's neat to hear it live. And the book, it's sweeping, it's deeply researched, it's beautifully told history. So let's start with something deceptively simple, and you've touched on it, but I think we can circle back. Your title. You chose a title that is short and direct. Native Nations, a Millennium in North America. But I think it telegraphs some really important points. So I just want to start off by asking you, what ideas or arguments were you hoping to signal with that choice?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Exactly. It's the argument about nationhood is right there, in the second word. I want readers to realize, basically, if you get nothing else from the 750-page book, I want you to understand that Native Americans lived in nations 1,000 years ago, and they live in nations today. Every Native American today is a citizen of their own Native nation as well as a citizen of the United States. And then Millennium, right? A millennium in North America is the second half. That's right. And I really started out on, I think my biggest inspiration for this book, or sort of most direct inspiration for this book, was a class that I teach at UNC, and it is just called Native North America, and it starts basically, as far back as I want to start it and goes till today. It was a class that actually was in place before I even got here, and I was sort of assigned to teach it. I found that daunting. But what I love about that class is every single student who takes it knows that Native nations were here a long time ago and that Native nations retained a great deal of power in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And every single student who takes that class knows that Native nations are still here today. So that millennium, I hope, sort of bridges that, carries that theme of nation through this really long period that I want readers to understand. That if a reader comes to this knowing about, say, Indian removal or residential schools, like those are really important parts of Native history, but non-Native people tend to know only the most negative parts, right? The the deepest tragedies, and those are true, and those are in the book, but they're only part of this long and fascinating and complicated history that is Native North America.
Yeah, and I love the way that using that title and focusing on that concept of nationhood really contradicts, as you say, the way many of us were taught to think about bands and tribes and as native polities as somehow less than the great nation of the United States.
Yeah.
To say that these are nations and they need to be thought of, in that way and
Yeah.
taken seriously in terms of their sovereignty and their history,
Yeah.
um, not
That-
just some unknowable mythic past, but a history.
Exactly. Yeah. And those words, bands, tribes, those are words of anthropologists from the 19th and 20th centuries. I think it's really telling. You probably know this from your own work too, that when 16th or 17th century Europeans looked at Native people, they were much more likely to use the word nation. Like they saw the say the Chickasaws and they said, it looks like a nation to us, and this is a kind of early modern nation. 19th century nationalism creates a different kind of nation, but it's what people mean by nation in that era. And they don't use bands or tribes or those words that sort of get put on later.
Yeah, 100%. Did you consider
Mhm.
any other titles along the way, or did this one come to you early on?
Well, I got to say, because Native power is a central theme, one of the like the working title for a while was Masters of the Continent, and the more I worked on it, the more I realized that women's history was really essential to understanding this puzzle of how did Native nations survive. In fact, the answer to that is often the nation, the identity that a people carried was perpetuated through the generations in the home, right? By women, grandmothers and mothers telling their children and their nieces and nephews over time that this is who we are. No matter what the outside world says, this is who we are. And I thought Masters of the Continent was sort of masculine and military and maybe a little, slavery even sounding. And I wanted to get away from that. I wanted to still talk about Native power, but to explain to readers that Native power is not just military, it's cultural and and many, many other ways of retaining identity and having influence in the world.
That's so fascinating. And you emphasize as well the importance of kin and kinship in
Right.
creating native communities. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
a nation is based in natal ties. So I can see
exactly.
why you would really stay away from the mastery idea and lean into the more kind of
Yeah,
family based
yeah, that's exactly
and
right.
women's
Right.
leadership. I love that.
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah.
Um, okay, I'm also curious. What made you decide this was the right time to write this book? Was there something in the current state of scholarship or maybe even the political climate that made you feel that this story needed to be told now?
Yeah. I think it really comes out of the scholarship. There have been just so many terrific histories written of smaller pieces of Native history. And so I couldn't possibly have written this sort of big synthetic book if there hadn't been this couple of generations of scholarship that's really Native centered. And so I wanted to pull that together for readers that I felt, I got to say, when people found out what I did, that Native history was part of what I write about, what I teach, um, I was still struck by how many times people said something like, "Oh, it's so sad what happened to the Native Americans." And then I have to say, Yes, definitely, but it's so much bigger than that. And so much of the work that historians and other scholars have been doing pushes against that being the only narrative. And I think just finally, the last, one more person said that to me, and I thought I want to write a big picture history that almost explicitly pushes against that being the only, like people's first reaction when they hear Native Americans.
Yeah, I know it's such a powerful intervention. Do you think that this is part of a kind of a broader shift in terms of how Indigenous history is being written and being
Yeah.
received, um,
Yeah,
kind of in the wider culture?
yeah, I do. I do. And I think, just there's so many different pieces of it, things that historians are writing, sort of projects that journalists are doing, Native cultural centers. There's so many more of those than there used to be that are thriving, that are open to the public, where you can go to in many, many parts of the country. You don't have to go very far to go to a cultural center, learn about a local nation, Native nation, on their terms, right? What they want to show you, what they want to teach you about their past and their present and their future. And and I think all of that comes together. And I know sometimes there feels like this cycle of like, why on earth do people still think some of these old versions of native primitiveness or decline, and they seem to have so much resilience, they just stick. And maybe or maybe not, this will be an era in which that turns around. But I do think this public presence of Native actors and writers and artists and politicians today is sort of unprecedented and may really at least get many, many more Americans asking questions about how is it that we still have so many Native nations around, and there's such a growing, they have so much growing prominence. How do we understand that in light of our sort of misunderstanding of the past?
Mm. That's just an absolutely perfect segue to my next question. Because in the introduction, you quote Shawnee tribe chief Benjamin J. Barnes. He urges scholars to, quote, work with, not on Indigenous communities. Can you unpack that idea for us a little
Yeah.
bit? What does it mean in practice, and how did it shape your research and writing?
Yeah, yeah. That call of his to work with, not on, was really powerful. And I think, for scholars in sort of academic scholars, it sort of started with archaeologists. I think that in the 1990s, the Congress passed the Native American Graves Repatriation right Act. I'm missing one of the words, but basically the legislation said that for archaeologists or anyone else who was doing research on graves, then they had an obligation to try to return certainly any human remains, but also any grave goods that were found along those to the descendants of whatever people they were. And I think there was a lot of crisis among archaeologists about, at first, about how to do that. But in the best cases, that requirement has led to real collaborations between Native nations and archaeologists who are learning from each other, both about the past, but also about things like, how properly to display um, thing, um, artifacts and what shouldn't be displayed, and all kinds of things about how to share them with public who's interested in them. So I think that has sort of spread beyond archaeologists to anthropologists more generally, to historians, to other scholars, and I think there's a real move lately for historians who tend to be most interested in documents, tend to be focused on the past. That's what we do, right? To think about the present and to think about kinds of knowledge that Native nations today, Native historians, tribal historians today can bring to our projects, the kinds of things we can do for tribes. So for example, bringing back from European archives, copies of documents from 16th, 17th or 18th centuries that talk about their people. And there are all kinds of collaborative work we can do together. So this is I focus in the book on several particular Native nations. It's not an overview that gives sort of equal treatment to all Native peoples. I use some as examples, and for those, I really tried to. I chose them for the most part because I knew people already within those nations, usually scholars within those nations, who could sort of teach me and guide me, and read my chapters and make sure I wasn't making big mistakes. And so I think there are different ways of working together, but that's some of what I try to do in this book.
That leads me to wonder, were there any moments as you worked on the project when that principle came into play in an unexpected way, or shifted something, the way that you thought about something really directly?
Yeah. In my very first book, my dissertation book, the Quapaw Nation was a big part of that story. And I talked to the Quapaw chief, and I learned some things from Quapaws going into that book. But it was only after writing that book that I really got to know more Quapaw historians, more Quapaw scholars, and to do things like I was just talking about, bringing documents back and learning from them, and sitting down and talking about language, and just in 1,000 ways I learned from Quapaw scholars. And I tell about in the book when the Quapaws Tribal Historic Preservation Officer was driving me around, or actually I was driving. I'd rented a car, and he was taking me around sort of to important Quapaw things. And the Quapaws are in northeastern Oklahoma now, or their base is there. And he showed me a religious building that they have built recently, and he said, I want you to talk about this in your book, the rebuilding of this. And that was one of those moments when I thought, okay, I could talk about the past and the present, and it is absolutely essential that what they're doing today and how that reflects on how they see their past be part of this book. It can't just be set in the past.
Yeah, I think that the interplay of past and present is so powerful in the book. I got to write a review of it for New York Review of Books, and I called it a magisterial overview of 1,000 years of Native American history. And I'll just say the phrase again, wow, right? Because that is a huge scope. So you've actually just said a little bit about how you approached it, but how did you meet the challenge of weaving together so many stories across such a vast geography?
Yeah, right. So I chose. Most of the chapters focus on one Native nation. It's not true for the first couple of chapters, but then after the first two chapters, I really focus on more or less one nation or a couple in a region, and try to use that story to that history in that particular place and time to illustrate some of the larger trends that were going on in North America. And so that helped me. Say I read a part about the Mohawks. I could look at documents from the French and the Dutch and the English about what's going on with the Mohawks. I could look at various oral histories and ways that the Mohawks and other Haudenosaunee nations talk about their past, and delve a little bit into language as best I could, in a way that I couldn't have done if I'd been trying to cover, 50 or 600 right, Native nations. And then the last couple of chapters of the book start to weave those peoples together. So I have only one chapter is focused on the 20th century. So it sort of moves people through the 20th century. And its central question is, how did Native nations survive what really, the very late 19th century and first half, early 20th century, were really the hardest times for Native nations to survive. And in that chapter, I return to all the peoples that I've introduced earlier in the book, and sort of use them as my examples for ways that nations survived the 20th century.
Yeah, it's really gracefully done. And it's an enjoyable read.
Okay.
For all of the information that it contains, you kind of really do guide the reader through it.
Thank
Were
you.
there moments when the scale of the project felt overwhelming to you or exhilarating?
Absolutely. It took a long time, for one thing, as the years went on and I missed my book manuscript deadline. That felt like I had taken on too much. Yeah.
I can only imagine. Just a fun question. What do you think will most surprise readers of your book? Were there any historical
Mm.
figures or events that stood out to you
Yeah.
in new ways once the book
Yeah.
was complete?
I think I, I guess maybe I pointed to Tecumseh. I sort of, if people have heard of Native American heroes, Tecumseh may be one of those. Tecumseh tries in the early 19th century to persuade all Native people to see themselves as Native Americans and not as Shawnees or Delawares or Chickasaws or Cherokees or Osage, but they should all see themselves as one people. He believes in separate creations. He believes that God at the beginning of the world created Native Americans and put them in the Americas, created Europeans and put them in Europe, created Africans and put them in Africa. And he says, he preaches, he and his brother preach, um, Europeans messed that all up. They came to our continents. They forced Africans out of their continent and into ours. What we need to do is reverse all that. Send Europeans back home, send Africans back home. And so I wanted to talk about Tecumseh and the Shawnees in that era as thinking about and debating about race. You know, are we a race? I think is sort of at the center of that question. But what I came to sort of realize as I studied more about Tecumseh, he is a hero. He is it's a great orator and thinker. But most Shawnees and most other Native Americans didn't agree with him. They actually, for the most part, large majority of them rejected that view of the world. And there were Shawnee women who said, my children are the children of a European. What does that mean for them? The world can't be the way you describe it because to be Shawnee, and my children are totally Shawnee, she would say, right? But in your view, they need to go back to Europe. They aren't Europeans, they're Shawnees. And our world isn't, we can't stop using European goods like hose. That's useful for farming. And so to me, that was so striking to see people rejecting a view of race that we might say is exactly the way maybe Tecumseh should have been thinking of it, that maybe the best path forward for Native Americans in the early 19th century was to fight with all their hearts militarily against the United States. But that's not what most Shawnees and most other Native Americans at the time thought. They thought we we live in a more complicated world than that. And in fact, I think their resistance to that universalizing of Native American identity is why we still have 600 plus Native nations in the United States today. They said in the 19th century and continued to say in the 20th and are still saying in the 21st century, we are not all the same, right? We are Shawnees and Delawares and Chickasaws and Cherokees and Lumbees and Navajos. We are not the same, and we may have some of things in common, but our primary identity is our tribal identity, and only second maybe Native American and citizen of the United States, and that people can be more than one thing, but they were not going to give up being their own community, their own Native nation.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, important point that you emphasize in the book, work of scholars like our mutual colleague Elizabeth Ellis, who really stress the fact that Native people would most like to be known by the names of their own nations, not by some generic category, Indian or indigenous or native that's imposed from outside that kind of flattens, all of the rich cultural specificity and uniqueness of different nations. I think that's a point you make beautifully in the book. And since you bring up Tecumseh, I'll just actually mention that changing view of Tecumseh is something you present in a lot of, I think, fascinating detail in the book. And it's really an example of how, by working with Indigenous scholars, you kind of reshaped your story. So in chapter 7, you describe visiting the Shawnee Tribal Cultural Center in Miami, Ohio, and realizing Tecumseh, who you might have thought would be like the center of the exhibits, was actually barely featured. And you started talking with Shawnee scholars about, kind of why that was. So I guess I'd just like to invite you to elaborate a tiny bit more about how that absence kind of showed you the ways that Native communities are choosing to tell their own stories today, and invite you to kind of reflect on the process of community-directed storytelling,
Yeah,
and how that may reshape our public memory.
yeah, yeah. One of the things that I heard Chief Barnes say at one point was, "We don't need another book on Tecumseh." I thought, well, there is Tecumseh in my book, but maybe I can have a little bit of a different angle on it. And I think, yeah, it really something that I think we sort of touched on this already, and I think it's a sign that it really grew on me over time just by going to cultural centers, talking to people, having people say what they wanted and didn't want in a big synthesis of Native American history, that it really made me understand how deeply important like things like the present and what's going on. So one of the things in that Shawnee Cultural Center, one of its exhibits is about pottery making today, and how really pottery scholars within the Shawnees and other tribes have gone back and tried to sort of learn and figure out what some of the pottery making techniques of their ancestors were, and in some ways recreate those and teach them to children today, but also use some of those both techniques and patterns and such of that to things like that to make new Shawnee pottery. And the Quapaws are doing much the same thing, and not to make reproductions, but to continue a long history that can change and develop. That their mothers, grandmothers, great grandmothers going way back did. And so I think that, people go to cultural centers. If you go to the National Museum of the American Indian, either in New York or in DC, although not today, apparently, what you'll see is a lot of connection between different time periods. Sometimes people complain that it doesn't, the National Museum of the American Indian doesn't have sharply a chronological story, like many history museums you go to, and this is a great way to do it in some cases. Start a long time ago, and as you walk through each room, it goes forward in time, and that is not the way the National Museum of the American Indian works. And I think that's really important when a museum that is founded by American Indians and run by American Indians, curated by them, tells their story. They tell it there. It is about connections between different time periods. And and another thing, both in that sort of in your question and in that museum as well, is material culture. And we were talking about women's history earlier. I think that it's very clear to see in those places, including in the Shawnee Museum, the Shawnee Cultural Center that you were asking about, that material culture and women's history through understanding material culture is a central part of Native American history.
Okay, well, I have more questions, but we have a wonderful audience gathered and they have questions.
Sure.
So I'd like to turn to a couple of audience questions before turning it back to you for a final reading. So one person has written in to say that they were recently at a museum, um, at the Whaling Museum in New Bedford. And they saw a poster called Naming Native Territory Today, and they've recorded the final sentence, quote, "Anyone non-native who lives on native land is a settler colonist. All land is native land." And so this person would like to know, um, what's a productive response to that?
Yeah.
If they're moved by it, what is something
Mhm.
they can do with that
Yeah.
response today?
Right, right. That's such a good question. And there are lots of different answers to that. Um, but one of them, I think first, just finding more about the history of different places, different parts of what's now the United States, different the peoples that once lived or today live where you are. And then finding a little bit about them today as well. One of the things I love to do with students, and I think it works for non-students as well, is say you live in Alabama and found out the Muskogee Creeks lived where you are. Look at their tribal website today. Muskogee Creek Nation still exists. It's now in Oklahoma. There are also smaller groups, including the Porch Creeks, that still live in their homelands and maybe close to you if you live in Alabama. Um, and the looking at those tribal websites just shows you how much a part of today Native nations are. So learn the long past, but also see what's going on. One of the things my students are really struck by when they look at tribal websites is, there's things about hiring and childcare, and history is just a little part of that website. Most of it is about what it means to run a government today that you can think of as much like some of the same attributes as a county government or a state government or a town government. And I think that's and from that, you may find some more practical things you can do as well. They may have a cultural center that accepts donations, money donations, right? They may have local events you can go to, and if that one doesn't, then play around some more and find some others. There are lots of ways to do things like that, and you can always give money to the National Museum of the American Indian, or other places like that are doing really important work.
And a related question that just kind of, I think, asks the same question, but on a slightly broader level. What lessons can contemporary policymakers and educators draw from the long history of indigenous governance and sovereignty that you detail in the book?
Yeah. I think just at the most basic level that democracies have been here a long time, longer than the United States. And democracies work in different ways. Most Native, sort of traditionally, I guess, at least, Native nations, their democracies were consensus democracies, not majority rule democracies, were governments in which people had to talk it out and work out a consensus. And that was hard, and there were all kinds of rules and guidelines and values about how to do it. And it didn't always work, but that was the goal, that was the value. Now, as Native nations, there was a period when the United States was trying to basically destroy Native nations and outlaw Native governance and such. In the New Deal, the United States said Native nations could reform their governments, and that they needed to be democracies, and that the standard was a majority rule democracy. So most Native nations today operate as majority rule democracies, but some are starting to sort of lean back toward the consensus era. And so I think sort of paying attention to some of the cutting edge changes in Native governance and conversations within and among Native nations about governance today is really exciting, and might be a place where the rest of us could find some guidance.
I love that thought. Another really wonderful question, I think, and maybe we'll close with this one so that you have a little time. But this comes in from someone from the Boston Public Library audience. Quote, what effect do you feel that Native authors like Vine Deloria Jr. and others have on the changing attitudes that we see now in how Native history and Native nations are described?
Yeah, well, I could probably just make that a quick answer and say lots, a huge, a huge effect on it. And continuing today, there's so many Native fiction writers, Native poets, and Native artists doing work that is is diverse, right? Right. It's not all the same, and shows that Native people, like all people, don't all think the same things as one another. They don't have the same experience as one another. That seems obvious when you say it, but I think one of the best ways to get at that is read like 3 novels by Native fiction writers, and they'll be different from each other.
Maybe we give out a shout out to Tommy Orange, who I see won a MacArthur today.
Exactly. Yeah, make that on your list.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, this was just so much fun to be part of. And I just thank you for sharing your insights and for the gift that your book is to readers and the challenge that I think it is to historians.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much also, Professor Eustace. And to you, Kathleen, this is what an illuminating conversation. We are so grateful for your help in shifting attitudes and really giving us a new perspective on history that so many of us need. We've learned a tremendous amount. And as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Series, we've asked Professor DuVal to do a final reading from her book. So over to you for that.
Great. Well, I'm going to read a little piece from pretty late in the book to kind of wrap things up. Tohono O'odham elder, Mary Jane Wan Moore, recalls how one year her grandmother returned to her family's saguaro camp for the season. This is a cactus, as she had for her entire life and her ancestors had before her. Yet when she got to the camp, her pots for boiling the saguaro syrup were gone. Someone had come upon this place, her family's property, and taken them. So when Wan Moore sees a Tohono O'odham pot in a museum, she often thinks, that pot is probably my grandmother's. In 1983, the UNC Research Laboratories of Archaeology began excavating the Occaneechi village on the banks of the Eno River near Hillsborough, North Carolina, not knowing that Native people whose ancestors had likely lived at that town were living just a few miles away. Today, though, collaborations between tribes and academic researchers, including UNC archaeologists, provide information about the past that was impossible to recreate when scholars didn't acknowledge Native people in their midst. And as the American Indian designers, curators, and administrators of the National Museum of the American Indian on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. have built, in large part with funding from Native nations, not a museum focused on colonization and loss, but a monument to the Native present in all its diversity, with connections to the past and to the future. Despite the tremendous losses of the past 2 centuries, Native nations have survived, not only as descendants of once powerful peoples, but as nations within the nation states of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Since 2000, the U.S. Census has counted more and more Native Americans, with the 2020 census reporting an astounding 9.7 million. U.S. policies did unfathomable damage, but Native Americans repeatedly rebuilt their nations and figured out how to continue being their own distinct peoples within a vastly changed continent. Richard West, who's Southern Cheyenne and founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, says, in the United States, all of us who call ourselves Native peoples have a profound feeling that a powerful renaissance is sweeping Indian America. The worst, which was very bad indeed, is over, and our confidence and our sense of cultural time and place is growing with each day. Joy Harjo, who's Muskogee and was the U.S. Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2022, closes her poem Anchorage with the bittersweet message of surviving genocide. She writes, who would believe the fantastic and terrible story of all of our survival, those who were never meant to survive?
What a beautiful, beautiful reading. Thank you so much. As a family history organization, we appreciate your book's focus on connections to the past. These nations work not only in honoring, but really recovering ancient traditions. Your book is a gift to all of us, encouraging not just survival against all odds, but also revitalization. And that is heartening, giving me goosebumps. So thank you. And a reminder to our audience, copies of the Native Nations, specially signed copies, can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you order, do input the code AMINS25 so the bookstore knows that you are connected to this event and you should get a book signed by the author on a book plate. This is your gift for coming. So thank you. The bookstore can send these special books to you, your friends or family anywhere in the United States. This is a wonderful gift for anyone wanting to understand our country and its people. Winding down our evening further together, Kristen, tell us a little bit about what's coming up at the Boston Public Library.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Professor DuVal. Thank you, Professor Eustace. And thank you all for being here. The Boston Public Library has a range of programs for people of all ages. We have them both in person and online. You can visit your local branch library or visit us at bpl.org. Our next program from the Central Library that you may be interested in, because it'll be offered virtually, it is in partnership with the GBH Forum Network, is on November 5th at 6 p.m., a Lowell lecture with costume designer Ruth Carter. You can find out more at bpl.org events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Margaret, back over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have co-presented tonight's talk with you. If you're researching a community, a nation, a person, a family, my colleagues are here to help. You'll see on screen some of the educational programs ahead hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center. Many of them are free to the public. Also, as a free service for your genealogical questions, we got many of them in advance of this event. We would like to help you. You can chat with one of our genealogists. Better yet, so we have a chat with a genealogist service. Better yet, visit us and our new exhibitions in the Family Heritage Experience at 97 Newbury Street in Boston. There you can see what we do firsthand. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, the screen's already popped up for you. First, I want to thank Susan Kay and John D. Thompson for their sponsorship of our free to the public book talks. We do one a month that's free and one a month that needs to be ticketed for the sake of our organization. And thank you, Susan and John, for your support. We hope that you'll join us for more author talks, all of you out there, in the weeks ahead. A week from tonight, we're looking at lineage in the colonial era. Brown University professor Karen Wolf will reveal how genealogy was a powerful force that shaped all segments of early American society. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, the remarkable Harvard historian, will converse with Dr. Wolf following her illustrated presentation. And on October 23, we'll gather in person here in Boston and also virtually online in celebration of the life and work of the acclaimed historian David McCullough. We'll hear from his daughter, Dory Lawson, about his life and the wisdom he shares in his new posthumously published collection of essays, History Matters. Dory will be in conversation with my colleague and president and CEO, Ryan J. Woods of American Ancestors. This event is on the eve of the Boston Book Festival, and they are our partners. Join us, join them, the Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network over the course of that festival weekend. We are all sponsors of that wonderful event. It's a super time to be in Boston. But back to tonight, our many thanks to our Pulitzer Prize winning guest speakers, Kathleen DuVal and Nicole Eustace. Kristen and I thank our producers at GBH Forum Network. And to tonight's audience, so many of you out there, thank you for joining us. We appreciate and applaud your interest in the history of our country, and we'll hope to see you soon again. For now, a very good night to all of you.